Hello and welcome to another episode of Bonjour Chai. I'm Ilana Zackon in Vancouver, and today we have special guest Rivka Campbell. Rivka is the executive director at Beit Raim Synagogue and School, co-founder of Jews of Color Canada, and the host of the new podcast, Rivkush, which will be premiering on the CJN Podcast Network this month. But before we dive in, a quick word from our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Atelier Lou Bijouterie in Montreal, Quebec. Atelier Lou specializes in watches and custom design jewelry along with a curated selection of designer jewelry. Visit us online or in person, and Eric Goldberg will help make your jewelry dreams come true. Atelier Lou is offering a promo code for all Bonjour Chai listeners using BON18 at checkout for 10% off your order at atelierlou.com. Hi, Rivka. Welcome to the CJN Podcast family. How are you doing today?
Hello. Thank you for the welcome. I'm doing excellent. It's dreary out, but I'm still feeling good.
Yeah, it's pretty gray out in Vancouver as well. And you're out in Ontario, yeah?
Yes, I am. Northern Ontario right now.
Very nice. So before we talk about your podcast, I was just curious about your own story. You reconnected to your Jewish roots a bit later in life. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you can talk to me a bit about what inspired that reconnection that made you want to go dig back and rediscover your roots in that way.
Okay, so really what precipitated it were my children. So my marriage had dissolved, and I remember looking at my kids and thinking, wow, these little people really need to know who they are. Like, it's almost, we needed a complete rebirth of the family. And that is a significant part of it. So I literally looked for a synagogue that would match kind of my Jewish ideals and threw us into it. Threw my children into Hebrew school, went every Shabbat, really delved in, like just went off the deep end kind of thing. Like, there was no holds barred.
Right. Were your kids quite young when you started going?
Yeah. They were, both my children were pre B'nai Mitzvah.
Okay.
My son would have been 12 going on 13. Oh, actually, I stand corrected. My daughter was post Bat Mitzvah. She wasn't Bat Mitzvah, but she was, I think, about 13, 14. There's only 20 months different. So not little children, old enough to appreciate it and understand it.
So what was that like as a transition, having this whole new extra, I guess, cultural and religious aspect to your life, and what was it like for your kids going into the community in that way?
I think they were angry at me.
Really?
I say that kind of,
Why was
is
that?
the word facetiously, just because you go from, you go from Saturday night cartoon or Saturday day cartoons, chilling, relaxing, to, okay, let's get up, get dressed, let's walk to synagogue. You go from chilling with your friends, certain, in the weeknights, and then all of a sudden it's like, what do you mean we're going to Hebrew school? What do you mean I'm prepping for a bar mitzvah? What do you mean I'm learning Hebrew? What do you mean we can't have any electronics? Why are we walking? All those things, right?
Yeah.
And the things that parents do to children, and it's our prerogative not to necessarily get their permission, but it's like we sometimes foist things on our kids, right? I think overall, I'm half joking. Like, overall, they really embraced it, and to this day, they're adults. And the one thing that I did, which was my goal, was to make sure that they knew who they were. However they choose to be Jewish in their adulthood, that's on them.
Right.
That's on them. But I really felt it was important to lay the foundation.
Totally. And so what was the moment that you started realizing that you needed to make a difference within the community in regards to your activism for what I've been told is called JOCs, Jews of Color?
Yeah.
Was that also inspired by experiences that your kids went through, things that you went through, a bit of both? Was there any particular moment where you were like, I need to do something about this? And can you tell me a bit about it?
Oh, absolutely. So, diving into the community, which I'll tell you too, I always felt was I'm not even going to say my privilege, my right as a Jew to be able to go into any Jewish space and know that I belong, just like any other Jew. So imagine my surprise when I realized that wasn't necessarily the case. And it wasn't about not being a familiar face, because yes, our communities can be very inclusive, I remember so-and-so from when we went to camp. Right. I remember so-and-so. So we do have that tendency, right?
The Jewish geography aspect.
Exactly. Yeah. But I realized, no, it's more than that. Because it's not saying, oh, did you go to this camp or did you go to this day school? Or it was more like, are you Jewish? And that is very different from Jewish geography, right? Jewish geography implies that you're Jewish already. Yeah. This is more questioning. And I would take it in stride. Sometimes I'd be very annoyed and very angry, hurt, all those range of emotions. But I kept being involved in the community. And then I started to drift away. And by that, I also mean not just me, but my kids started to drift away, still lived in the Jewish hood, still did all that stuff, but really wasn't so engaged with synagogues or any other Jewish thing. I hit a crossroads in my life where my kids were now older, living out of the home. It's like, okay, what am I going to do? I'm kind of about my job. So I decided to go to Israel. And I literally packed my bags, got rid of my place, sold my baby, my Jeep, which obviously I still regret to this day because I still mention her. And I just pretty much, and connected with somebody I didn't even know in real life in Israel because I needed a place to land.
Right.
And people were saying, are you coming back? And I said, I don't know. So I went to Israel. I ended up staying almost a year. But it was in Israel I realized this is how we should be.
Right.
And one of the moments for me was a Friday night dinner. And I was hanging out with some friends. And I looked around and I'm like, look at this crowd. Look at us. There's me, the Black Jew whose family comes from Jamaica. There's another Jew whose family comes from Peru. There's another Jew whose family comes from Spain, from Poland, and from India. And we are sitting there just chilling, just a bunch of Jews on a Friday night. Yeah. And I said, this is how it should be everywhere. And that is, so when I came back to Canada, my tolerance level for those questions, my tolerance level for our community was next to none. Yeah. I'm like, you know what? We need to do better and we can do better. So I am going to now speak about Jewish diversity, speak about how you greet people how we welcome people in their spaces, not our spaces like you're coming into my space, but our spaces. And this is a collective space for all of us regardless. And we need to behave in that manner.
I love that. Yeah, I have a few relatives who are Jews of color, and I've heard similar stories about going to Israel and no one batted an eye. Because, Mizrahi is the highest percentage of Jewish population in the country. And there's so much diversity in general. So it makes me almost wonder if this is a diasporic problem. Do you know what I mean?
I think it is. And, and it's funny when people talk about Israel and they talk about some of the, because let's be real. I will never call Israel a racist country. You will never hear those words coming out of my mouth. I will say there are racist people. But I also say to the people who say that, who live in the diaspora, perhaps you want to look in your own backyard first before you criticize others.
Fingers.
Having said that,
right.
Yes, of course, there are racist people. But I was starting to notice, I'm like, who, if you're going to say there's a a commonality among those who are racist. I'm like, why is it people who came from the diaspora? You see what I'm saying? I think, did you bring your racism with you to Israel? I've actually wondered that. Because if I ever had a questioning, which was very rare, it was from somebody from the diaspora.
So fascinating. That does say a lot.
Okay. Yeah. I'll give you another example if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
Just to, okay, so the last trip I took to Israel was my pre-pandemic trip. So it was, we came back in beginning of 2020. And sadly, when we were there, a good friend of, was it that trip or the trip before? Anyway, so that actually doesn't matter. A good friend of my equal other, his father passed away. So we went to Shiva quite often, actually, because he was like his best friend. And there was this conversation, we're just chilling. There's this conversation primarily being carried on in Hebrew, but I was picking up the words that this person was saying. And I also picked up the words that Yoram was saying. And then the conversation ended, and Yoram turned to me and he says, oh, she's asking you questions like if you're Jewish, if you're that, if you're this, if you're that. And I said, wow, I said, it's interesting. And she spoke English. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And afterwards, Yoram and I had a private conversation. I said, I find it strange because she's Israeli. And Israelis don't ask me those questions. And he said to me, oh, but she lived in the United States for like 30 years. I said, there it is.
Yeah.
I said, there it is.
Yeah, it almost makes me wonder what the bigger issue is, I guess. Like the society that we live in here in North America or in the diaspora, or it's like an insidious problem like within communities themselves. Because to me, it feels like, if it's so different in Israel, it must be something bigger than us, like the politics and the inherent racism that's built into the countries that we live in here in this side of the world. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean, and I would concur.
Yeah. So when you were coming back to Canada, were there other allies that you found in the community, like other Jews of color that were already starting to have these conversations or wanting to make a difference?
Yeah. I had to scare them up, but because actually the work was mainly being done in the United States, because not only they're not just a larger population of Jews, the percentage within that population of Jews of color is higher than in Canada. I mean, my goodness, the percentage of Black Canadians in Canada is far less than in the United States, right?
Yeah.
So there were bits, the work was being started in the United States, but really not in any great deal. There's a couple of organizations that were just getting their footing. So I started looking for online groups, and I found one on Facebook. Absolutely hated it. Absolutely hated it. And I made no bones about that because it wasn't, they were blurring issues, because there's also this other group called Hebrew Israelites, and who have caused challenges actually within the Jews of color community. And so it was like, it was overpopulated by Hebrew Israelites, and I was getting so frustrated. So I started my own group. A minority within a minority, because you know what? If you really can't fix, then just do your own thing. So I did my own thing. Yeah. And that group grew.
So is that the beginning of Jews of Color Canada?
It was. So it grew and grew and grew. But then I thought, still a heavy American influence. And I am Canadian. So I started, along with somebody else, Jews of Color Canada. And then started, reaching out to Canadian Jews of color. And, we've had our ups and downs in terms of connecting with people. COVID has been amazing for that, because I've been able to connect with JOCs and out east, out west. And because, Canada's so freaking big that it's hard in person, but it's totally doable via Zoom. And so it's been great.
It's awesome.
It's been great.
And so now with your podcast, I saw in your trailer that the kind of main focus is more about the perspective of JOC people, as opposed to talking just about issues that you face and that kind of stuff. So can you tell me more about that distinction and why that's important for the Jewish community to understand?
Sure. Because one of the things that I realized, walking in the community, looking the way I do, there's either a perception that, she's new to the tribe, so she really doesn't know the tribe aside from maybe what she learned in her classes. There was that perception. And I found that people would look at me and not almost as like, whether they realized it or not, it was almost like they didn't have an expectation that I would have, for example, an in-depth knowledge on Israel or the Palestinian-Israeli relationship and that kind of bothered me. And because I would see it in terms of when, we would talk about, even just recently with the last conflict, and I would say, okay, here's what I understand about it. And I would be like, and the faces were like, oh, wow. Like they were shocked that I would know it. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Not only do I have huge books on international law and versus Israel and so on, I am also Jewish. I have an opinion on JOC things. And it's really important that you see this face speaking about such matters, that it's not always about how do I navigate myself through the community. Most of my conversations are around the same things that other Jews speak about.
So you're saying, if I'm getting this correctly, and maybe I'm totally off here, but that there's kind of two facets to it. Part of it is within the Jewish community, like having your place, having a voice, bringing in your perspective. But then also maybe from the outside for other, let's say, people from the Black community, seeing you and saying, oh, this is a Black person who's also Jewish, and now I can understand the perspective of Jewish people through like you. Is that ever something that comes into play?
Absolutely. It's interesting that you should say that, because not a lot of people hone in on that aspect. Because within the Black community, and it depends, the Black community is not a monolith, so it depends on, where they actually are from. So, for example, Jamaican people have an understanding of Jews. And because, at one point it was colloquially called the Jewish island. So when they see me, a person of color who's also Jewish, they're not as like, it's like, oh, all right, whatever, and move forward. But I think it's important for the Black community as a whole to recognize that, I face anti-Semitism also.
Yeah.
And I don't even really know how to articulate it, but I think it's important that they also change the view that they see also of who is a Jew. And if they see that somebody who looks like them and is saying, here is the story of my people, my Jewish people, here is how some words you may say may affect me, just like how as a Black person some words that some people say affect you.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm making sense.
You're making total
kind
sense.
Of pulling that, kind of using that connection that we have to give a better understanding of Jewish people in general.
Yeah, it's so important. I don't know if you heard about the Black Jewish Alliance. Have you heard of that? It's in the entertainment industry. It came up during COVID.
In the United States?
Yeah, in the United States.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I follow them online, and I think it's so important. I work in the arts, and I think, we face so many struggles, even though they might look different from the outside, but we're both minority groups, and it's so important for us to lift each other up. So I think the work you're doing is so important. So I was wondering, in your podcast, is there any particular narrative in a particular issue that you feel is really missing, like something that you're really excited to be able to share through this new outlet? In regards to like a JOC perspective on XYZ.
Absolutely. I feel a narrative that is missing or is being misrepresented, let's say, is the narrative around Jews of color and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that is something that, there are people who assume that just because because there is that narrative, and I will be blunt, there is that false narrative of, colonialism, white colonialism in Israel. So they look at me and say, well, then you must be on the side of Palestinians because you're brown like them. And I'm like, well, not all Palestinians are brown. You're kind of stereotyping, just like not all Jews are white. You know what I'm saying? But that sometimes is the expectation that Jews of color should be on that side. It doesn't help when organizations that are primarily Black focused are coming out and are pushing that false narrative also. Yeah. So then it kind of brushes over JOCs too. Yeah. And I think it is so critical to recognize, sure, there may be a JOCs who absolutely are like, I am pro-Palestinian. That is their right. But don't assume that we all think in the same manner. And I think it's important that JOC voice is heard speaking on that situation in particular.
Wow. I didn't even think of that. That's a really good point. I'm looking forward to you being able to express that publicly. I think that might stir up some things in a really positive way.
I hope so.
So within your community, do you feel like the challenges that you face that you've mentioned to me about, people questioning your Jewishness and all that kind of stuff, is it a similar experience for most JOCs when you talk to them? Is it kind of like across the board, like, oh yeah, we've experienced this? Or is there sometimes like experiences that are distinct, let's say, to an individual based on what part of the diaspora they live in, do you think?
I think there, like in anything, there are Jews who can say, I've never experienced anti-Semitism. I felt comfortable in non-Jewish spaces. I think there are also people of color who can say the same, I haven't felt it, et cetera, et cetera. But I think generally speaking, because we're not even just talking about, big R racism, there's all those microaggressions
100%.
And that some people may recognize as being really inappropriate, or based on their own personality, their own makeup, may just go, yeah, it's okay. They asked me that question, i.e. the convert question. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being a convert. But why is it that JOCs are asked that question more than any other racial group within Judaism?
Yeah.
And it's just like, and that is a microaggression that really actually says the sentence that they're saying, but not saying, is, well, you don't naturally belong in my community, so I need to find out how you got here.
Right. Have you noticed any changes in regards to that since the Black Lives Matter movement became so big in the past year? I know it existed before, but it really caused people to come up and make a stand. Have you noticed any shifts? I know it's been COVID, so it's kind of hard to say, but
you mean in shifts in how people perceive me?
In regards to the Jewish community, I guess, because a lot of the work that you're doing, right, is so that people aren't questioning that you should belong there. And now that there's so many people talking about lifting up Black voices and that sort of thing. Have you noticed any change or not? I was just curious.
Okay. Yeah. No. No. Good question. Yes. So I've been doing this work now for, oh my gosh, I tried to count and I can't even count how many years, just let's say a while. And normally when I speak to people or I discuss the topic, I get a lot of Canadians are polite. I get a lot of polite smiles and like, oh, thank you for sharing. And that's it. And still, the reality is still the questions and the microaggressions, all that stuff. When George Floyd was murdered, there was, I think, an awakening for the Jewish community also, because I was suddenly getting phone calls, and people who knew me well were saying things like, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I will be okay. Kind of used to it, sadly. I just have to process it.
Yeah.
And then there were people who were like, oh, have you felt any of this in the community, in our Jewish community? And depending on who it was, I'd be either like, yes, or are you bleeping kidding me? What do you think I've been saying for years now? Why do you think when you say to me, I've never really met any Jews of color, and I say to you, because you haven't made it welcoming, so they don't come out. I said, all these things I've been saying. But I think to myself, okay, at least there is a realization now. And the difference I've noticed is people are doing the work. They're not just talking the talk, they're doing the work. Yes, there are still some challenges to remind people, not about us without us. So don't make any grand statements, don't make any grand changes without actually seeing if this is what we would like done. Mm-hmm. Don't do it to us, because that's the same thing. Do it with us or ask us. That's still a challenge. And, it's still, and there will always be those who are like, oh, I think you're just seeing something that's not actually there. You'll always have those. But overall, there has been a shift, a positive shift.
Wow. It's amazing how, it's terrible, but it's amazing in some way about how something like that has to happen for people to open their eyes. And I can only imagine, I know I have a relative who's Black and Jewish, and I know she felt extremely overwhelmed in the past year with all the talk, which is really constructive, but with all the anti-Semitism rising on top of all the stuff going on with Black Lives Matter. It was a lot to take in, but I'm glad to see that it's definitely opening people's eyes. So, it's a lot.
Yeah. And there was this, I think it was articles that were going around just saying Black people are tired. Because I think we were tired within the, within the overall community and within the Jewish community. Understandably. Because there was a lot of demand for our voices. And there was a point where I thought, I'm going to break. I'm just like burnt out, and like you said, not just on the anti-Black racism stuff, but on the anti-Semitism stuff. I was getting super, super tired, but it must be done.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's emotionally 100%.
Taxing. You're exposing yourself. You're making yourself vulnerable each and every time you speak about it. Each and every time. It takes a little piece of you.
So just to wrap it up, I was wondering if you can talk about some of your goals that you hope moving forward with the work that you're doing with your new podcast, Rivkush, with the work that you're doing with Jews of Color Canada. What are some of the things that you hope to see in the future that still haven't quite happened yet?
I would like to see almost a normalization of JOCs in the community. And I have this teaser for a documentary, and I think at the end, I say I want it to get to the point where I don't have to talk about Jewish diversity, that it just is. Don't have to constantly say, we Jews come from all corners of the earth, that we just know that. I would like to see people who look like me, or Asian Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Jews whose origins are outside of Eastern Europe. I would like to see them represented on boards. I would like to see them represented, as our teachers, as our educators, as our rabbis, as our cantors, as everything that we do. I want to see a face that either looks like mine or is a face that is diverse. I want, when we talk about Jewish food, we're not just talking about lox and bagels and kugel, but we're talking about foods from Iran, we're talking about foods from Yemen, we're talking about foods from Jamaica as Jewish foods also. I want to see us grow as a culture, as a people, and display and celebrate our diversity. That's what I want to see.
Absolutely. And I'm totally right here behind you with that. Well, thank you so much, Rivka, for taking the time to chat with me today. It's been a pleasure.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much.
You can check out the new podcast, Rivkush, coming out this month on the CJN Podcast Network. Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for Thursday, July 15th. Our producer is Michael Fraiman, technical production by Andre Goulet. Our music is by Socalled. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us a comment and a rating on the platform of your choice and let us know what you think about our discussions on the CJN Lounge on Facebook. I'm Ilana Zackon, and have a great evening.